Now, I'm very excited about meeting all of the passionate individuals who are coming together to learn, to grow. And on behalf of Robin Speculand and Antonio Nieto Rodriguez, over the next 2 days, we're going to have a full agenda and lined up. There is a lot of great content, especially curated for you to equip you with the insights, the tools, the roadmaps that you're going to need and want to bring back to your business. Now, the lineup is impressive, if I may say so. You're going to hear from leading experts in different industries and from around the world, all of whom have mastered the art of implementing their strategy successfully. And they're here to share with you their secrets, their ideas, and we're confident that you're going to leave these 2 days buzzing with inspiration and armed with the practical tools that you need to revolutionize your own business. Now, we were looking at all of the people signing in. It's amazing to see all the people from around the globe: China, Middle East, Ethiopia, Singapore, Australia, and many, many more. And this year, as we welcome all of you to the Great Implementation, there's going to be something a little bit different. Let's call this a conference with a twist. This isn't a conference that's just about absorbing information or listening to voices speak at you. This is a reverse conference, or maybe you've heard the term unconference, where there'll be a short presentation at the start, but the majority of what we'll be talking about, it's going to come from you. So we invite you to open your microphones, get your questions ready, share your experience, because it's the wealth of information and knowledge that all of you bring that's really going to set this year's conference apart and be the perfect partnership with this great lineup of presenters that we have. Hand this over to our hosts and talk a little bit about their achievements. Now, before we formally kick off the Great Implementation, I would like to take a moment and introduce the co-founders of the Strategy Implementation Institute. And first of all, it's a pleasure to introduce to you Antonio Nieto Rodriguez. Now, Antonio is the author of Harvard Business Review Project Management Handbook and 4 other books. And he's been the creator of some of the ideas I'm sure that you've encountered, concepts such as the project economy and the project manifesto. His research in global impact and modern management have been recognized by Thinkers 50. He's the former chairman of the Project Management Institute. He's the founder of Projects & Co. and co-founder of the Strategy Implementation Institute. Now, born in Madrid, Spain, and educated in Germany, Mexico, Italy, and the United States, Antonio is fluent in 5 languages, has his MBA from London Business School, and he's a member of the Marshall Goldsmith 100 Coaches. You can follow Antonio through his LinkedIn newsletter, Lead Projects Successfully, and also over at his website. Now, our other co-founder and co-host today is Robin Speculand, who is a recognized pioneer and expert in strategy and digital implementation. In Robin's work, he's driven to transform strategy implementation by inspiring global leaders to adopt different mindsets and approaches. He's the founder of 3 companies. Robin's the CEO of Bridges Business Consultancy International, co-founder of the Strategy Implementation Institute, and digital leadership specialist. Robin's a TEDx speaker, a Thinkers 50 nominee. He's a facilitator with some of the world's very best institutions: IMD Business School, Duke CE, and Singapore Management University. And he's a part of the top 30 global gurus. As a best-selling author, Robin has written 6 books, including his most recent, World's Best Bank, a strategic guide to digital transformation, and Strategy Implementation Playbook, a step-by-step guide. So without further ado, my friends, it is a welcome to introduce both Robin and Antonio.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Wow, conference is finally on us. 2 years of planning, 2 months of build-up, the last 2 hours of hang and sending messages and getting everything organized. It's an absolute delight to kick off our great implementation biennial conference 2023. Thank you, Michael, not only for that wonderful introduction, but as he mentioned, our Ricky, unfortunately, who is on with us, is unwell, and Michael has very kindly stepped in. So thank you for that, Michael. And even more importantly, thank you to all of you. We have everyone still coming in. It's an absolute delight to be with you today. As you can see, I'm based in Singapore, and we do encourage you to put your location onto your profile name, and that will let everyone know where you are. Because the benefit of being a virtual conference is that, of course, we can entertain people from around the world without having to worry about the carbon and people flying and hotels. So this is the advantage. The disadvantage, of course, is we can't see you all in person, but it's a trade-off. We've been planning, Antonio and I have been planning this for months now, and we're delighted that we are going to hear from Liran in a few minutes, from Google on the challenge of employee wellness. And thank you, Liran, for joining us. Paul will hopefully be able to dial in and be joining us to share. Paul Lemart is at PwC heading strategy. And Paul is going to talk about the role of a leader in implementation. And then our final session in today's half of the conference will be the founders of Thinkers 50, which are Stuart and Des. And the reason we split it up over 2 days is because of the time difference. There was no way we could please everyone. And you saw in our introduction the number of members. We continue to grow in the hundreds. And our members, you saw, come from New Zealand all the way over to South America. So it was impossible to get everyone. So that's why we stagger the timing, but it is being recorded. But just to reinforce what Michael said, the value is going to come from yourselves contributing into the conference. It's a reverse conference. So Liran is going to talk for maybe 15 minutes. And then after that, we're going to have a good discussion about how she and Google really focus on employee well-being. And then tomorrow, we're delighted, we'll also have the inaugural awards. So I'm going to hand over to Antonio just a moment, but I would like to thank our 147 strategy implementation professionals from around the world, which is our growing number. Antonio and I started the Institute with a passion to have more implementation professionals, so that number delights us. We're also delighted with our two, Casey and GT, who are on the call, our two fellowship who qualified last year. And the fellowship is the level above the professional, where you don't just demonstrate your knowledge, but your ability to implement as well. So we'd like to recognize them. And we'd like to say thank you to all our board members who've supported us in the creation and now the running of the Institute. So many of you who know me know my passion is very much strategy implementation. And at the end of the introduction, we had a quote that I'll just go back to, which said, "You can have the greatest strategy, but it's useless without the great implementation." because customers don't notice your strategy, they notice your implementation. So our goal is to share with you hands-on tips and tools to support you through our strategy implementation roadmap. And that's our passion for today.
Thank you, Robin, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's nice to see you all today. I think it was amazing introduction by Michael, and the tone is set for the 2 days. It's always a pleasure to get together. I think with this new world where everything is online and and you have small calls, I think what we wanted to do today and tomorrow is something a bit different. And Robin and I have been thinking about how can you get most out of these 2 days. I think one thing we all hear is AI every day, I guess, AI, ChatGPT, and the disruption that is coming. And one thing that comes across very clear is that we will survive, but we need to learn, and we need to keep developing to make it happen, to become better, to learn how to adjust for these new technologies and use them in our advantage. So I'm very excited to see all of you here to contribute, to learn together, because that's what's going to make us stronger and better. And so the passion on this topic is clear. I think Robin, myself, Michael, all the speakers, Liran, and all of you, we share similar passion around the need for better implementation, better projects, better strategic initiatives. We are pioneers in this space. There's many people talking about implementation still after so many years. We are one of the few areas or few groups that really spends time to think, to research, to share, to build a community, to build a program, a course, a certification. So I think this is great. It makes us unique, and I want to thank everybody for being here. In terms of what I think the Institute, many of you already know the Institute, but we really, since we started, Robin, I thought this has to be about quality. This is not about volume, it's quality. We want the best for all of you, so that makes you more successful in your careers. That's the starting point. And that's what we focus all the time with whatever we do. Many of you have been participants in the monthly meetings, which have become now a tradition. I think we've done probably more than 12 or 14, and it's great interaction that we get from there. We have developed this strategy implementation professional certification, which we keep giving more and more attention. Companies are signing up to train 15, 20 individuals. So this is looking very promising when now companies realize that this is a core skill. And what is interesting is not a core skill for a few individuals in a company. What you can see today in this space is that everyone in a company needs these skills. Everyone is working on implementation, not just the strategy office or the program managers. So that's very exciting because we have the platform, we have the certification, we have the community, the passion. So we're very much looking forward. We have also developed the new frameworks that were not existing. The strategy implementation roadmap has been used by many companies already, and we're going to focus on that today, but mostly tomorrow. So a tool that is easy to understand, easy to implement, that helps everyone to execute their strategies. We also launched the body of language, which now is the strategy implementation playbook, a great success and something that was needed as well in the market. So I think we would have never done this without the support of the community, the passion that you share with us, the contribution, the sharing, the monthly meetings. All this has make us stronger, and it's a journey. I think we're still at the beginning, There's much to come, and we're excited about today. I'm very pleased to be with Michael, with Robin, with Liran, with all of you to discuss, topics that matter, topics that will make us better from different angles, from a workplace perspective, from a strategy, from a personal brand, Thinkers 50. So, Robin, Michael, thank you for this introduction, and I look forward to the next session.
Fantastic. Antonio, Robin, thanks for those words. And Antonio, I second your emotion at this point. As somebody who is a encore career neuroscientist working here in Singapore, I am very excited to introduce our first presenter today, who is Liran Gold, an Australian registered psychologist based here in Singapore, and the APAC Regional Care Manager at Google. Now, Liran's expertise includes clinical and forensic psychology, and she has experience working as a trainer, consultant, clinician, and program manager in corporate, educational, and clinical settings. Liran's niche areas of specialization include threat assessment and management, workplace violence prevention, and suicide risk management and prevention. She's the president of the Asia Pacific Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, a member of the Australian Psychological Society, the International Association of Forensic Mental Health, and the Asia Crisis and Security Group. And what we're going to be kicking off the conference with is a talk that is around designing and implementing employee well-being strategy. And during the kickoff 15 minutes, and remember, after those 15 minutes, this is your conference. So do type your questions or observations into the chat box. But during this 15-minute presentation, Leanne is going to share information about the current state of employee well-being and briefly discuss the main challenges in designing and implementing an employee well-being strategy inside a large organization. And as the audience, you should expect to walk away with practical tips for reviewing and refining your own corporate well-being strategy. And once again, get those questions ready. So it is indeed a pleasure. Liran, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Bear with me as I get the presentation slides up. It looks like when I share my slides, it automatically mutes me. Are you able to help me unmute when I'm sharing? Or Robin, would it be easier if you share the deck?
Yeah, you just need to give me a minute. I will pull up your deck. So why don't you say hello to everyone, and I will just take a second to open the file.
Sure. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Michael. And I really liked hearing the Antonio and Robin speaking about how much the Strategy Implementation Institute has done. I'm fascinated to meet some of you on the call, and I've been watching the chat and seeing that people are joining from all over the world. So when I put this presentation together, I knew we'd have a very diverse audience with people from all different sectors, different areas within their organization, small, medium, large enterprises. So I've tried to gather data from with a very global perspective. And I'll share with you, if the data is gathered from a particular region, when I'm sharing that study, I'll share where it's been gathered from. But I have tried to keep things as generalizable as possible so that the takeaways you have are applicable in your location and for your organization.
Okay, and I'm going to share the screen for you now.
Thank you. Okay. So as you mentioned, we're going to be covering these 4 areas: why employee well-being is so important, the current state of employee well-being, and some of the main challenges in designing and implementing well-being strategy before we talk about the way forward. So on the next slide, I want to talk about the difference between employee well-being and employee engagement. So when we're talking about employee well-being, really what we're looking at is the overall health of the individual. And we're going to look at a model that has 7 pillars of individual well-being. That differs from employee engagement, which is about the relationship that a person has with the company that they're working for. And we know that there's a direct and very important relationship between well-being and engagement, because if you have a healthier employee, they're going to be able to engage better. And the future of work really is about employee well-being. Let's go on to the next slide and look at those pillars of holistic employee well-being. So I'll start off by talking about physical well-being, which sounds relatively straightforward, but it's actually very complex. It encompasses many different aspects. We're talking about exercise, sleep, lifestyle, food choices. And a lot of forward-looking companies are thinking about how they can communicate the importance of daily habits to enhance their employees' well-being. An example is at our Google office, we have the really sweet sugary snacks located on a low shelf that we have to bend over to reach, whereas the healthiest snacks are at eye level and are very easy to access. Right? Other things that we have around physical well-being is we have something called the Flu Fighters campaign, where there is a team that works on raising awareness around getting the flu vaccine to help reduce the impact when it comes time to flu season around the world. The next one is career well-being. And through the pandemic, there's been, we talk about the Great Resignation and all of those sorts of things. But basically, workers are reevaluating their career goals and what's important to them. There was a survey done in the US by Prudential that found that a quarter of workers were planning to look for a new job when the pandemic was over, and close to half of workers were rethinking the job that they wanted in the future. So with this shift in priorities, a lot of employers have to think about how they can enhance their employees' careers. How do they retain talent? Is it about compensation? Do they need to think about enhancing learning and development programs? Can they create better internal mobility opportunities for people? These are some of the things that we're thinking about, and they're particularly important right now because we have new ways of working with this hybrid work model. The next is about financial well-being, and this doesn't necessarily mean that somebody has a lot of money. It means that people feel secure with their finances. So financial stress is one of the top causes of employee stress, above and beyond the stress from their job, their health, and their relationships combined. So it's a lot of stress. That was a finding by PwC in 2021. So it's not necessarily about you paying your staff more. It's about having staff feel like you care about their financial well-being. And some examples could be providing resources for people to understand how to manage their money better, or even giving directions for where they can go to get financial advice from a trusted source. The next one is social well-being. And we know that having meaningful friendships in your personal and your work life is one of the key predictors of long-term happiness. So when we think about how that works at work with this new hybrid model, or a lot of people working remotely, there are a lot fewer opportunities for people to connect with their colleagues on that social level. So when we're thinking about the kind of strategy we want to build around this, we need to think about managing some of those social challenges. HP, they actually created specific employee resource groups for remote workers and for working parents who manage homeschooling during the pandemic to help them connect with that social community around them and feel less isolated. The next one is community, and I think there are a few levels here. We want to think about the community at work, like your community of colleagues, but also your local community. And when you feel connected to your local community, research has suggested that you also feel more connected to your employer. There are plenty of ways that people go about doing this, and a lot of employers actually sponsor community programs. Other things that people offer are giving their employees days to volunteer that are actually paid, so they don't have to take their annual leave. And there are various ways of going about doing this. One other part about the community aspect is that this can actually contribute to many of these other pillars as well. To the social aspect, to the emotional, when we feel like we are contributing to our community, it helps us feel good, as well as our sense of purpose. So purpose is what grounds an organization in a set of values. And we know that employees, particularly millennials and Gen Z, want to work for companies whose values match their own. So people that work for organizations that are willing to do the work and to engage, they tend to work for companies whose values align with their own. And there was a study done by Gartner that found that when an organization took action on a current social issue, the proportion of workers who were considered highly engaged increased from 40% to 60%. The last pillar here is emotional well-being, and I can talk about this pillar for a very long time. But essentially, pre-COVID, there was already a strong push for employers to take care of the emotional well-being of their staff. During COVID, that was at the forefront. Everyone was in not necessarily the same boat, but in the same storm when it came to dealing with the stresses that the pandemic brought. And I think a lot of companies have implemented resilience programs and all sorts of things around this. But recent research has shown that 1 in 5 surveyed workers say that their mental health is worse now than it was this time last year. So this is something that, even though there is a lot that employers are doing, we are still in really difficult times and people are struggling with their emotional well-being. All right, so on the next slide, I wanted to draw the link for you between well-being and the bottom line. And sometimes this is the angle that people take when they're speaking to their leadership about why an employee well-being strategy is important and why it should be important to them. At its most basic level, when you have healthier employees, you're going to have higher productivity, higher profit, and better customer loyalty. You'll also see reduced absenteeism and presenteeism. And if you haven't heard the word presenteeism before, this is when you have employees who show up for work, they're sitting at their desk, they're typing on their computer, but they're not engaged, they're distracted, they're not particularly productive. And when you have good well-being programs, this actually reduces a lot of those reasons for absenteeism and presenteeism, which tends to cost the company 2 to 3 times more than any direct healthcare expenses. For larger companies that cover the healthcare costs of their employees, Harvard have actually done some research that shows that for every dollar spent on employee wellness programs, a company saves $3.27 on healthcare costs alone. So that's a very nice figure to show people when it comes to return on investment in these sorts of programs. And lastly, we tend to see higher job satisfaction and staff retention when we have happy employees. So we've covered what employee well-being is, how it's related to engagement, and how it helps with the bottom line. On the next slide, I want to give you a snapshot of the current state of global employee well-being. And this is from a Gallup study that was released in 2022. It's freely available online. I encourage you to take a read, and it breaks down things by regions. There's a lot of information in there, but I've pulled out a few things to highlight for you. So the number one thing that stood out for me was that stress amongst workers at a global level is at an all-time high. It is highest in East Asia. And when I say East Asia, this includes China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, and Mongolia. Only 1/3 of the global workforce would describe themselves as thriving in their workplace, and South Asia had the lowest thriving score in the world. This includes India, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Europe had the lowest employee engagement rate in the world at 14%, and I think we can discuss this for a while, but I'm not exactly sure why Europe has the lowest engagement rate. I also wanted to highlight that employed women in South Asia reported the highest levels of daily anger and feeling disrespected in the world in 2021. The reason why I've highlighted this is because when you're thinking about designing and implementing well-being strategies for your organization, there are going to be certain populations that are particularly vulnerable to certain stresses. So in this study, it found that women in South Asia are a special population that perhaps we need to prioritize when it comes to employee well-being. And depending on where you're based, what your industry is, there'll be pockets of or sectors of your workforce that may need extra attention. On the next slide, a nice quote from the study: organizations need to think about the whole person, not just the worker. So what are some of the challenges that come up when we're designing and implementing strategies? So I think one of the biggest ones can be awareness, and at many different levels. So in order to gain buy-in from your leadership as well as from the people on the ground, you need to make them aware that there is a problem and that you are looking to solve the problem, right? If you don't raise that awareness, then people are going to say, you know what, we don't really have that problem, so we don't need to solve for it, and we don't need a strategy, or we don't need to invest in this. And resourcing is a big part of how you look at designing and implementing a strategy. You can have wonderful strategy, but if you don't have the resources to make it happen, that's going to make things very difficult for you. You also need to have awareness of roles and responsibilities. So this is something that can become very confusing in large organizations. Who owns things? What are their responsibilities? How are we tracking and measuring what people are meant to be doing? And then at a personal level, having self-awareness of our own expertise and the limits of our expertise. So there are some organizations that can pay for an external consultant or an organizational psychologist to do an analysis and write them an amazing strategy and an implementation plan. That's wonderful if they have those resources, but it doesn't mean that if you don't have those resources, you can't build a strategy. The important part is to be aware of your limitations and work within that so that we're not overreaching when we're designing our well-being strategy. The next part is scope. And depending on on the same slide, scope. So there are benefits and disadvantages of having a really wide scope where you're looking at company-wide strategy versus looking at your, perhaps like an organization within your company or a vertical within an organization versus doing something on a smaller scale, perhaps at a site level. So again, this is going to be dependent on, your organization and what capacity you have, but think through what's going to be better for you. It also depends largely on resourcing. So if you have less resources, you may need to think about having a smaller scope. Localization versus generalization. So I've seen some very successful programs that are extremely localized, and I've seen very successful programs that are, company-wide, very general, and they've landed well. One thing to think about with those broad, generalized campaigns or strategies are that you need to think about language, marketing, and narratives for the different sectors of your workforce. An example of this is we run a fantastic Domestic Violence Awareness Month campaign each year at Google where we raise awareness around the issue. And it's usually led by our team in the US. And when we first ran it, they recognized that what they build for a US audience is not going to land in the same way as it will for the audience in APAC. And actually, we need input from people who are on the ground in each country and each site to say, how is this going to be received? What language do we need to change? How do we need to tweak this narrative so that all of these parts of the campaign can actually be impactful? Scope when you're talking about scope, you should also think about who to target, like those special populations or particularly vulnerable populations that I mentioned earlier, and that will help you prioritize. So even companies that have an incredible amount of resources invested in employee well-being still need to prioritize certain populations over others. I've seen that there are many companies that are prioritizing manager well-being at the moment because managers have so many pressures on them. So there's different areas that you can go into depending on your context. The last area to talk about are silos and efficiencies. So there are benefits of having a centralized versus a dispersed team that is looking at designing and implementing your strategy. Again, it comes back to awareness of roles and responsibilities. So in very large organizations, you can have a centralized strategy, but you may need to have dispersed roles and responsibilities across the organization to actually implement. None of it can work effectively unless we're communicating both intra and inter-organizationally. So if you're doing a strategy for a particular vertical or particular site, you need to communicate with others outside of your group so that you know who else is doing the same thing that you're doing. What I've seen a lot of is that there'll be many people who care deeply for these issues, and they will take the initiative to start something themselves, and it's wonderful. But there may be 3 other people that are doing the same thing, and that's not particularly efficient. If they can combine their resources, pull their heads together, then they can be much more impactful in implementing their strategy. This is also important when it comes to ownership, energy, and momentum. So if things are siloed, then when people run out of energy or they start losing their momentum, the campaign or that arm of the strategy may start to lose steam. And if you're communicating with others and you have champions across your organization, you can reach out and use their energy, use their momentum, and say, you know what, like, we are feeling burnt out. We need someone to take the torch and continue this strategy or iterate so that it can be implemented more effectively. All right, so on the last slide, I want to talk about the way forward. And these are some areas that I think are particularly important. Metrics, impact, and iteration. So when you're designing your strategy, start with understanding how you're going to measure impact. What we see a lot of are people who say, we have a great program. We delivered 3 training sessions this quarter. That's not an impact metric. That's just how many training sessions you delivered, right? What you want to know is, did your training make people feel less stressed? Do they feel more competent in managing their finances? Are they going to commit to making one small change to their physical well-being? So think about how you can measure impact, and that will help you make data-driven decisions, and you can then iterate your program. Another thing to think about are campaigns. So if you are working somewhere where, actually you can do this whether you have a well-built out strategy or none at all, piggyback off existing campaigns. There are so many out there. And if you have a cause that is meaningful to you or your organization, have a look online. There is so much out there with freely available resources for you to pick up and go with. It's a very small lift, and it's an easy way to start small and start somewhere. Think about the gaps and think about how to bridge them. So often in larger organizations, you have grassroots organizations that are doing a lot of work on the ground. You have leadership sitting at the top, setting the strategy, and they're not talking to each other. Help bridge the gap between them so that the leadership know what's happening on the ground and the people on the ground know what their strategy is so that they can work together. Another thing to do is to find champions. Again, these people do not have to be mental health experts. It can just be people within verticals or across your organization with different expertise who care about the cause. They're going to be the ones that can be the face of a campaign, or they can share their story, they can raise awareness, and they can really work into the strategy that you set to help you implement. We've covered some of this: reducing barriers, centralizing communication, and it can be something as simple as creating a centralized calendar. So again, for large organizations, in Singapore, for example, we created a centralized calendar for Mental Health Month so that every grassroots group, employee resource group, official well-being people could put in the events that they were going to be running, so they didn't clash, but also we could cross-promote and help each other with the overall mission of raising awareness or doing more for people's well-being during that month. And take stock of what already exists. Again, in large organizations, often there are some amazing resources that are just kind of hidden, or you have to search for them, or people don't know enough about them. See what you have, make it easily accessible. And if you don't have much, then you can look for what's available out there. You can start with freely available resources that are designed for your sector or a particular group within your organization. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, please don't forget to support the supporters. So often organizations will go to HR and say, solve this problem, make our workforce happier. But frontline HR are under so much pressure. they're managing compensation and performance and complaints, and they're tasked with a lot, and they're sitting with employees who are having a tough time. They're exposed to a lot. We need to think about specialized support for them, as well as managers. Managers often feel like their employee well-being is their responsibility, and sometimes this can be problematic. Sometimes it means they put in extra effort. It needs boundaries, but managers are under a lot of pressure too. So think about including support for the supporters in your strategy. All right, we've covered a lot of content. Thank you so much for listening, for having me here today, and I'm very excited to get stuck into a discussion.
Okay, thank you, Libran. And to facilitate that discussion, Antonio, I believe we are going to breakout groups.
No, I'm going to have a chat with Liran first, Michael.
Oh, my apology.
So we've got a lot of questions that have come in, so I'm going to take those first. So Liran, I have to be laughing. First of all, while you were chatting, the chat box has been going off like crazy, and trying to track all the questions that came in was not an easy challenge. So very well received, and thank you very much, first of all, for taking the time, and second of all, for being and sharing with us. Okay. Let me start off just with a couple of questions. We appreciate, that Google has done an amazing work and is, one of the leaders in employee well-being. Just to give the audience to get to know you a little better. How long have you been at Google now? And if you can come off mute, thanks.
Yeah, almost 4 years. It'll be 4 years in July.
Okay, and you're in Singapore now, and how long in Singapore?
I've been in Singapore for 9 years now, so Singapore feels like home.
But it's not original home. Where's originally?
No, I'm originally from Sydney, Australia, so I grew up there, and I came to Singapore for 6 weeks 9 years ago, so I ended up falling in love with the place. Yeah.
And your background is very fascinating because you've not come through the very traditional business or an MBA or an engineer, software. So just maybe you can I know we did an introduction, but just for everyone, because it's a very unique background for Google, isn't it?
Yeah. So I never imagined that I would be in a corporate setting, let alone at a company like Google. It wasn't something that I set out to do. So I studied forensic psychology, and my interests were in threat assessment and threat management. So
hang on. What is forensic psychology? we all know cognitive psychology. What's forensic psychology?
So a lot of people think about like CSI and those sorts of shows on TV, and it's not really like that. Basically, forensic psychology is is the intersection between the law and mental health. So traditional roles in like forensic psychology roles would be, for example, a psychologist who works within the prison service or in inpatient mental health wards for offenders. Those are the more traditional forensic psychology roles. Not necessarily my cup of tea. For me, I was really interested in working with young people and families. So when I first came to Singapore, that's what I was doing. I was working in the private sector with young people and families who were in crisis, with what you could describe as like more extreme problem behaviors. So things like suicide prevention and threat management, when it came to violence and things like that. So that's where I started. And I've been heavily involved with APATAP, the Asia Pacific Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. I started consulting and training on these really niche areas. And then in 2018, Google approached me to come on board as a consultant for the CARE program. And after several months, a full-time role became available, and I applied for that. But the program that I manage at Google looks at that interplay of security, HR, mental health, legal, for helping employees who may be struggling with mental health concerns that also present with concerning behaviors or security issues. So it's quite a niche area. In other regions, you might think of it more traditionally as workplace violence prevention.
Okay.
Which sounds very scary. I think in the US, they're very comfortable talking about workplace violence prevention. Over here in APAC, people tend to freeze a little bit and say, oh my goodness, do we have a problem with violence in the workplace? And the answer is no. We have employees that we want to take care of. And a lot of the work we do is supporting people who may be experiencing domestic violence or stalking or have mental health issues that are causing like significant disruption in the workplace, and we offer resources and support. So it's a really fantastic role.
And if you had to, well, you just gave me, okay, my next question was, if you had to sum up in one adjective working in Google, what would be the adjective? But you gave me fantastic, so give me one more.
Oh my goodness, this is hard. I would say eye-opening.
All right.
Yes.
So you shared, and thank you for the overview. But many companies, as you know, struggle to deliver employee well-being, despite it being on the radar for so long. If you had to give them maybe some simple initial steps to start making a difference for their employees, could you help? Just advise us. Where would you begin?
So I think I would start by looking at the resources that you already have within your organization, because otherwise you won't know what's there and what's missing. So consolidating those resources. The second thing would be, if you want to start small, choose a pre-existing campaign that's already out there with resources that are available. That's a good place to start. And finding your champions. So even before you have a strategy in place, or if you already have one but you're looking at reevaluating it, find the people within your organization that care about this and that are willing to join you, whether it's in a working group or just a person that's willing to share their story, to raise awareness. There's so much that we can do on that individual level if we have identified champions. It also gives them a sense of responsibility and a role that they can step into. It's a good way for them to step up. It looks wonderful when it comes time for performance reviews and those sorts of things, to say that you're contributing to the culture and the community within your organization.
And the word champions is something in change management implementation we're all very familiar with. But from your perspective, maybe one tip, how would you identify the right champion? What would you look for maybe in terms of character or behavior that you go, yes, that's a good person to have as a champion?
Yeah, so I think, so recently I organized a panel to highlight women in security, and we needed to find speakers for this panel. And I was thinking, who would be great champions for this cause, right? So women, but I wanted to also have people with different backgrounds, people in different locations, and they tend to be the people that will always put their hand up for an opportunity like this, which is wonderful. So I want to include them, right? You can always ask for volunteers, but there are also people that you get to know over time who are perhaps more quiet, more introverted, but they have incredible stories to share. And so I think when you know someone on a personal professional level, and you know that they have an important story to share, ask them if they're willing without pressuring them, because it's also about the message that you want to be sent. So for this panel, I did reach out to someone who they're not particularly comfortable with public speaking, and I knew that, but I also knew that they had a really interesting story to share. So, I said to them, hey, we're putting this thing together. I thought you'd be a great candidate. What do you think? And they took it on. They really enjoyed the experience. I don't know if I would call them a champion that's going to continue promoting and creating awareness, but for that particular event and for that audience, it really worked. So you can do it on that, I don't want to say small, but you can do it on that smaller scale. We also have people in the organization that put their hands up. They reach out to like employee resource groups and say, I have a story to share. I want to promote this. Tell me what I can do to help you. So take those people on and you use that energy and that momentum that they bring.
Okay, no, thank you for that. There's questions I'm going to get to in a moment. I'm going to kick off with Elmo's in a moment. And Elmo, if you're there, then you're welcome to ask in a moment. But I've got one more question before we go to Elmo, and then Liang, who's up in Shanghai. What about an example of a successful employee well-being initiative? Because you've run so many of these in your 4 or 5 years at Google, can you make it come alive? Because our theme of our conference is hands-on, strategy implementation, roadmap, tools, and tips. So maybe you could share an initiative that helps it come alive for people on the conference.
Sure. So during the pandemic, there was a huge need in the employee well-being space, and much greater than what any organization could really meet. There was a lot happening, but what I saw within the security vertical that I sit within was that, there wasn't enough that was specifically being done for people that were on the front line doing COVID response. So I thought, what if we share a daily tip, right? A daily well-being tip. It can be drink an extra glass of water, or take 5 minutes over your morning coffee without looking at your emails. Like very simple things. Again, doesn't require like a mental health professional to share these well-being tips. And I went to my leadership and I said, look, it's something very simple. We can share it daily. And they were like, all right, let's see how this goes. I don't know if they thought it would be particularly effective with this group of people, which tended to be, and I'm making big generalizations here, but quite male dominated, and they don't really talk that much about well-being in like public spaces, right? So here I am, a psychologist in a security organization, talking to them about how they can take care of themselves. It was, I think, a little jarring for them at first. Within a month, some of the people who I thought would really not be interested in this at all would start our daily calls by saying, what's the tip today? We're so excited to hear it. And they really were invested in it. And my goal wasn't to give them, groundbreaking tips. It was just to introduce the idea of talking about well-being regularly, and hoping that they could bring that to their teams. Soon it became region-wide, so every member of our organization within APAC were hearing the daily tips. We then created a library of these daily tips because we didn't want them to just like float out. We wanted to be able to go back to it, right? And we shared that library with other people. Other regions started hearing about how the APAC security team have this wonderful daily tip, and they asked us to incorporate it into a weekly global call. So we then had our weekly global tip for the whole security organization, which was fantastic. And we did this for, I think, almost 2 years. That's a lot of tips, right?
Yeah.
So we built out that library. We also started gathering input from the people that were receiving it. Does this still resonate for you? Do you find it meaningful? Do you want to keep hearing about this? And some sectors said yes. Others said, you know what, I think we're okay now. I don't think we need it. And so we pulled back to a weekly tip and then to a monthly, which kind of, it aligned with like during the intense times of lockdown during the pandemic, people really wanted to hear it. And as things started easing and people got a little bit more accustomed to this new way of working, we pulled back. And that was, how we iterated. And now the library still exists, and we use it for weekly tips that go out in our newsletter. And that's kind of where it's landed 2.5 years later.
Wow. So very smart. I mean, first of all, fantastic that you gave little tips for people that just, and I loved one of your first ones, that have your coffee without reading your emails.
Yeah.
But then checking in, as we use in Agile today, just checking in, saying people, do you still need it? If not, thank you very much. It's not permanent. And if you do, great, we'll give you some more, and then creating the pool of ideas that people can go into. And obviously it worked in terms of the growth you had across the region, across Google. So well done on supporting people on that. Now, we've got about 15 minutes left, so I will dive into all the questions. I'm going to give everyone the choice. Elmo, do you want to ask the question, or shall I read it? Are you there?
Sure, I can ask the
Hey
question.
there.
Thank you, Robin.
For joining.
Yeah. So my question is, how an organization has a great well-being strategy, but there's also this business strategy of a workforce reduction. How do you reconcile that so that the employees don't see two competing strategies in its implementation?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I think it's really hard to do that because when people see reductions in force, they feel like an organization may not care as much for their well-being as they thought. I think this is something that a lot of large organizations face, and ultimately what it came down to in my own experience was knowing that a lot of these business decisions are being made way up in the leadership chain, and actually my manager and my team and my director and my vertical, they still deeply care about employee well-being. I still see champions. We still have our campaigns. All of the incredible benefits are still there. So they're not pulling back on what's being given. So I think that's how I've kind of reconciled the two things. But also, I think part of it is understanding that even, Google Singapore was rated for 3 years in a row as the best place to work, right? It's still a multinational organization that needs to make hard business decisions in difficult economic times. And so I think I don't envy the business leaders that had to make these really hard decisions. So this is something that I think if I was sitting in a leadership position and looking at company-wide well-being strategy, I would be asking this question to the experts and saying, how do we reconcile this? How do we boost morale now? How do we get people back to feeling productive and engaging well with the organization? We're lucky at Google that we have very strong employee engagement, and we have a workforce culture where, most people that you meet who are Googlers deeply care for the work they do, and they're aligned with the values of the organization. So when we have that as the baseline, I think it may be a little bit easier for us to come back to that baseline after the reduction in force. But we'll see how things go. It's still very fresh, and in some countries it's still going on. So
Okay,
I hope that answers
thank you.
your question.
Thank you.
And on that note, Liran, and Elmo, thank you for the question. While you're discussing that challenge, Liang, if you're there, do you want to come in, or I'll read your question?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Liang. So Liang is up in Shanghai. Ni hao, Liang.
Well, thank you, Robin, and thank you, Loren, for sharing your insights regarding employee well-being. So I just had a discussion with a few friends the other day regarding remote work and employee engagement. So common consensus is that right now people already...
Oh, Liang, we lost you. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah, I didn't click anything, but what I was just saying that it is a common practice globally that a lot of companies are having this remote working policy, and we know somehow it benefits the employees' private life and work-life balance, but at the same time it creates some kind of challenges for employee engagement. I would like to know from you, Loren, that how do you see that it will shape, employee well-being going forward? Is specifically how, companies, for example, like Google, can continue to have this remote work policy, but at the same time increase employee well-being and increase employee engagement. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So I think earlier when I was talking about different sectors of the workforce, it's going to look different for different people. So for a young single person who is relocated to work at Google, remote work is probably not going to be their top option. Again, I'm making generalizations here. And they really want the on-campus experience, right? So that their needs are going to be different from a single parent who can finally be with their child more because they can work from home. They can have flexible hours. They don't have to rush to pick up their child or pay extra expenses for longer daycare because they're home. So their needs are going to be quite different. And there's a whole spectrum of what people need. I think the way that Google are approaching the hybrid work approach now, which is in general, ideally people are in the office 3 days a week and work from home 1 to 2 days a week. There's no cap. So if you want to come in 5 days, you can. But they suggest you come in 3 days. And I think we're still, again, it's still early days for looking at the data on how hybrid work versus fully remote versus fully in office compare. But we have had really productive few years. I know different industries will have, different responses to this, but at Google, we didn't see a productivity slump over the last 3 years. People were working so hard. Whether that can be maintained is another question. And I think as people from that personal side cycle through life changes, their needs are going to change as well, which is why our strategy needs to adapt. For example, when I first moved to work from home, I really loved it. I got to be with my young one. I got to spend more time with my partner. I could take earlier calls with the US and I could stay up a little bit later for my calls with EMEA. It worked so well. When I had my second child, I could not focus at home. I really preferred to be in the office because there was too much chaos at home. And I found that I was more distracted at home than I would be at the office. So that was within like a 2.5 year period. My needs changed significantly. And now I choose to go into the office 5 days a week. But I have other people who really they are so much more productive at home. So I think it will depend on the person, and having flexibility in the way, and also autonomy. Like managers should hopefully know what's going to work best for their team. So you can have these large company-wide best practice. I think the implementation will come down to specific organizations and managers and directors within who have the final say on what's going to work best for their team. There are some teams that simply need to be together in person to do the kind of work that they're required to do, whereas others have actually always worked remotely. I have a very dispersed global team. There are people on my team I've never met, and we meet weekly on video, so it doesn't matter if I'm in the office or if I'm at home. So it depends on the function, the life stage, and then how a manager chooses to implement that broader strategy.
Well, thanks
Does
a
that
lot.
answer your question?
That really helps. Different person have different, priorities, and they have different preferences, and we got to manage a disciplined workforce for better implementation.
Yes. I think there's also, it's important that we learn from the last 3 years that we can hopefully trust employees to do the right thing, even when we can't see what they're doing. And that's a hard thing for a lot of people to internalize, especially in more traditional sectors, where, you get in at this time, you don't leave until the boss leaves. If you're not seen to be at your desk, then it means you're not working. So these are some of the workplace culture changes that can make part of your employee wellbeing strategy to help create that flexibility around the way we work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leanne. We have a couple more questions I'm going to squeeze in. We got about 5-6 minutes. Yulina, are you there? No. Okay. So let me request. Oh, you there? Hi there. Good on you.
Took me a moment to get to you.
No
Crystal.
problem. No worries. So you've got a great question about onboarding to help employee well-being. Would you like to ask Liran directly?
Yes, thank you
Thank you.
so much. Thanks, Niran, for everything you've said so far. And I feel that I'm coming in after some of your answers that may have touched on it, but psychological safety. I think it's a big one. But what I'm thinking of in the context of what you said, so I'm changing my question a little bit differently. It feels like we're looking at psychological safety that is driven by our external factors. Do we have a look at the organization and its internal behaviors and volatility or lack of, or change and volume of change, and how does that impact the well-being and the safety we feel as an employees? And do we ever measure that?
Yes is the short answer. So it's really important that we look at how an organization is creating a culture of psychological safety. And they'll be that at a very broad level. So for example, in the tech sector, psychological safety is being eroded, not necessarily from a particular company, but because across the sector, there are layoffs happening. So that's going to shake that foundation of safety because it hasn't necessarily happened in this way before. And it's not that a particular company has done a particular thing or that my company has done a particular thing. It's that in our sector, things feel a little bit less stable. So that's an important thing to consider, on if we zoom in a little bit, I think psychological safety within teams is a huge factor. There's that saying that, people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad managers. And that has a lot to do with psychological safety. So I think that's one of the really critical factors that contribute to job stress, to financial stress, because you don't feel financially secure or safe if you don't feel psychologically safe at work. Contributes to your sense of community. You don't really want to be part of your workplace community if you don't feel psychologically safe there. You're less likely to engage with your team, with your manager, to look for resources if you don't feel safe to share that you're not feeling okay. So psychological safety underpins so much of this, and should be a key consideration when you're designing your strategy as well as implementing. You can give managers tools, but if they come to their team and say, so I hear that people are feeling stressed, suck it up, here's a video, that's not going to make them feel safe, right? So and creating safety does take time. It can be harmed, right? So there are things that happen with the teams that disrupts that sense of psychological safety, but it can also be rebuilt. So I can talk for a long time about this, but in short, it is a very important part of designing a strategy.
Yeah, and just to reinforce on what you're saying, from an implementation in a digital world, we all know experimentation is becoming more and more as we use design thinking, as we use hackathons, and for people to experiment, they got to feel that safety as well. So absolutely. We have two more, if we can, questions. The next one is Mubarak. Are you there?
Yes.
Hey, Mubarak. Good to see you.
Yes, Mr. Robin.
Hey, good to see you, my
Nice
friend.
to meet you.
Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, I have two simple questions on employee well-being. The first one is, how can leaders effectively measure and track employees' well-being, and what metrics or indicators should be used? This is the first question. And then the second one is, how can leaders create a work environment that promotes work-life balance and prevents burnout? Thank you.
Okay, so Larianne, I know the connection there wasn't the best. Did you get it? The first one is on the metrics of it, the second one on work-life balance.
Yes, and these are fantastic questions. So metrics, there's so many different ways you can measure this, depending on which of those pillars you want to look at. So one thing that we do internally at Google is we run something called Google Geist, which you probably heard of, you can look up, and it's a yearly survey done by all employees voluntarily, that looks at many different aspects of well-being, engagement, psychological safety, all of these elements of the overall strategy that we want to look at. And it builds and iterates each year based on the findings from the previous year. And it takes a huge team to do that. So it's not an easy task. There are well-being trackers that are freely available online. So, for example, if you just search like employee well-being tracking measures, there are plenty of research-based tools that you can use to track things across an organization. If you're designing something yourself, I would ask yourself, like, what is a meaningful metric for me? So during COVID, for example, we built a education program for our frontline staff that was focused on emotional well-being. And so, we were like, how are we going to actually measure the impact? It's not just how many people hear this lecture on resilience. We want to know, do people feel more resilient after hearing this session? That's a really hard question to answer. Okay, so how do we break it down further? Do you think that the content of this talk was applicable to your daily life? Do you think that the content of this talk was helpful for you? Are you likely to implement strategies from this talk in your daily life? Would you recommend this for other people? And then, of course, getting feedback on what we can do better. And, we used a 5-point rating scale, and we used the same metrics across all of our education sessions so that we could compare and contrast, see what worked, what didn't work. We also asked people to put in it was anonymous, but we asked them to put in their region or their location so that we could see, people in the UK found this more helpful than people in Singapore. It just didn't land so well for people in Singapore. So those were very specific things that we were looking at when we were delivering those training seminars. I have also heard of things like asking really simple questions like, how stressed do you feel today on a scale of 1 to 10? And asking members of your team every Friday how stressed they feel, right? So that could be like something that you track regularly, but it's important that you want to do something with that. So I think that the metrics tracking will link to what your overall goal is with your strategy, right? It's easy to say, well, I want my employees to be happier, but how do we measure that? There's a lot of research out there. I encourage you to go out and read. And there are measures that companies have built, that organizations have built, that you can use that are freely available.
So why do you have to ask? Can we not ask them if they're stressed on a Monday rather than the Friday?
You can do both and then see, are they more stressed on Monday than Friday?
How many meetings have you done between Monday and Friday?
Yes.
Liran, you've been so generous with your time and your knowledge and your sharing. Personally, I mean, you and I know each other, and I think the work you do in Google is phenomenal. The forensic psychologist, when you first shared it with me, you had my attention from the first moment. I think the participants today, just from the range of questions, you've hit on a very sensitive area. We are at a time, instead of the great implementation, unfortunately, we had the great resignation last year. Many people didn't have that, as you said, they left because they didn't have a good boss. They didn't like the working environment. It is so critical in the implementation that we look after our employees. So on behalf of everyone on the conference, from Antonio, Michael, and myself as the host, we'd like to extend our very much thank you. Can we give a virtual round of applause to Liran, and from everyone, just say thank you, and for your time sharing, thank you for giving it.
Thank you so much, Robin and team. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Liran.
Thank you. And if I am correct now, my apologies for speaking over you, Antonio, but we have reached the point where we'll put you in your breakout groups, and it's an opportunity to share either your questions, your insights from Liran, or anything that might be going on in your organization. So add to the conversation and keep it moving forward. But Antonio, I think the rooms are ready now.
Yeah, we're going to do the protocol. I'm just putting it up for you.
Okay.
Can you see it now? Is it up? Yeah.
Yeah, it's clear.
Okay. So, Michael, are you going to run through, or do you want me to do it?
Absolutely. So you've been put in quartets, so you'll be working in fours. Even if somebody has a connection issue, your group will still be long enough. Most importantly, do select a discussion leader. That discussion leader also needs to manage the time. And once you are brought back from your great breakout groups, we'll ask that discussion leader to post any questions in the chat box. Of course, anybody can post, but it'd be great if each group had at least one contribution, and we'll look for the leader to do that. But anybody, again, can post their questions, and we wholeheartedly encourage them to do that. Robin, how long would you like the breakout groups to be?
The
open?
breakouts are going to be 14 minutes.
14. All right.
14.
And the reason for that is, you know, we want to help build the community. Part of my Antonio and my focus, Michael, is to grow globally the implementation community. So we want to do two things in the breakout. The first one is to give you an opportunity. The group are going to be maximum 5 people. So give you just an opportunity, 1 minute each, to talk and get to meet other implementation people who are passionate about the subject. And then to have a couple of minutes each to share about implementation, specifically from what Liran just shared about employee well-being.
Great. And each discussion leader should put one contribution in the chat box.
Thanks.
Awesome. 14 minutes.
All right.
Okay.
So,
I'll
Antonio,
put it on.
there we go.
Yeah.
All right.
Say
See you all in 14 minutes. Have a great network and discussion.
Right. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for the participation. So the next topic is one of the highlights of the conference, and some people and two great persons I very dear to me, and we've known each other maybe already for 10 years. Des Dearlove and Stuart Crainer. I came across Stuart. He was doing some editorial work in London Business School magazine. We connected, and we started, collaborating. And they have been fundamental in helping up building my career, my space in this thought leadership world. And so I'm very happy to see them. I know they've worked with Robin as well, so it's really a pleasure to have you both here, Des, Stuart, and thank you for joining us. So the idea is that you present a few slides, and then we just have an interactive Q&A, and we let people participate. But thank you, and great to see you, Des. Stuart, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for those kind words. Of course, we fully appreciate. We made you the man you are today.
Yes.
yeah, and thank you. It's really nice to see such a great global audience and some familiar names in there as well. So we're going to start by telling you a little bit about the Thinkers 50 and how the Thinkers 50 has evolved over the last 20 odd years. We started the Thinkers 50 in 2001. I'm usually on the other side of this, so I'm going to try and share my screen now. And I always feel slightly frustrated when it fails when other people try it. But I'll see what happens now.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Yes, is that entirely out of character?
Yeah,
so the Thinkers 50 aims to be the most reliable resource for identifying, ranking, and sharing the leading business ideas of our age. We have 3 kind of bold things that keep us going: a purpose to provide the world's most reliable resource; beliefs. Our fundamental belief is that ideas have the power to change the world. I think it's difficult to deny that. But another belief is that management is essential to human affairs. And management often gets quite a bad press. We in the UK, where we're based, we have a very large national health service, and a lot of the criticism of it is about the number of managers. but it's difficult to see how such a huge, complex organization can exist without managers. So I think managers are essential to human affairs. It may not be the right managers in the right places at times, but management is crucial. It took management to build the pyramids and so on. And we also believe that fresh thinking can create a better future. So more of that later. Why we're really pleased to be here today in particular is that we want to inspire business leaders to explore and connect with the best new ideas, to innovate and grow. Ideas are nothing without implementation. Actually making things happen is really the key. And we hope that the thinkers and the people whose work we promote and champion are ideas that can be translated into action, because that's what matters in the end. Over the 20 odd years we've been working on the Thinkers 50, we've created a community of the world's leading business thinkers. I'm sure you're familiar with some of the names here. They're all people we've featured on the Thinkers 50 ranking or in the Thinkers 50 Distinguished Achievement Awards. I'd just like to reprise now the winners of the Thinkers 50, the people who have topped our ranking. The first one in 2001 was Peter Drucker, in many ways the creator of modern management, somebody who was talking about knowledge workers in the 1960s, way ahead of his time. It's a shame his books are actually quite hard work to read, I've always found, but his ideas were really, really, really prescient. So him being number one wasn't exactly a great leap. Our second number one was Michael Porter of Harvard Business School, creator of the 5 Forces framework, expert on industry clusters, champion of shared value. What's interesting about Michael Porter is the sheer practicality of his ideas and the impact of his ideas. Every business classroom in the world features the 5 Forces and his work on industry clusters. So he's been hugely influential. You might argue about the 5 Forces and their validity now, but their influence is undeniable. And he's also advised entire countries on their strategies. Des, do you want to take over, CK?
Yeah. So our next winner was CK Prahalad, who I think it's fair to say actually had quite a profound influence on the thinking of Stuart and myself, because we came to this as somewhat skeptical journalists, and perhaps were not complete believers, but we spent some time with CK and got to know CK, and his ideas really struck a chord with us. You will recall he wrote The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, and suddenly you could see that business and management had a role to play in alleviating poverty. And it was really quite inspirational. He was a very generous man with his time and his ideas, and had a profound influence on us. We began to see that some of those beliefs that Stuart was outlining earlier, that they really began to resonate in a new way for us. So we've been changed along the way by these ideas. So CK topped the ranking twice, and then was followed by the late great Clay Christensen. Yeah, who, I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar with his work, The Innovator's Dilemma and Disruptive Innovation. Again, a very inspiring thinker. I mean, we're going to talk about some of the qualities and attributes, characteristics of great thought leaders, but one of them that both of these gentlemen sort of role model is humility. They were both very humble men, but with very, very powerful ideas. So Clay was followed by Roger Martin, who was just referenced, The Opposable Mind, his work on integrative thinking, and playing to win. And I mean, he's been influential in a number of fields. He also topped our ranking. Followed by
Shang Kim and Remy Moburn.
You're going to change the slides. What's happening with the slides? Yeah. Followed by the creators of Blue Ocean Strategy. W. Chan Kim and René Maubourne in 2019. Again, very, very powerful ideas that I think a lot of people will be familiar with and have tried to implement. And in fact, they've gone on to create all manner of tools and canvases to help with the implementation part of their theories. Then in 2021, Amy Edmondson picked up the crown, as it were. And again, psychological safety, we were hearing about it earlier. I think it's everywhere now. It's not just entered the business lexicon. People talk about it in the pub. I mean, you know, it's a big idea. And Amy has championed it. It's not one of those overnight successes, I think, that took about 20 years because she's been doing this for a while now. But finally, I think people, as I say, one of the measures of successful thought leader is when we pick up the language, and we talk about Blue Ocean strategy, we talk about fearless organizations, and we talk about psychological safety.
And the 2023 Thinkers 50 will be held on the 5th and 6th of November in London. That's our advertising break.
Thank you, Stuart.
So people often ask us what we look for. I mean, I don't know if that's what you're going to ask, Antonio, what we look for.
Exactly. What are you looking for?
Well, we use two sort of broad concepts when we're trying to map the world of thought leadership, and we call them viability and visibility. So the viability part is the quality and relevance of the ideas. You know, we look at, I can go through, we look for the relevance and the rigor and the reach. It's really important that it's generalizable in the sense that it reaches across multiple industries and across borders as well. We want ideas that can travel and are relevant to multiple industries. And we also look for ideas that are going to stick around. So they have to be robust and they have to be resilient. But the second thing we look for is visibility, if you like. That's the other axis. And visibility is all about the influence that the thought leader has. And we look at things like, you know, media presence. And of course, in the 20 years we've been doing this, that's changed from just being mainstream media, traditional media. Now we look at social media as well and look at people's followings and how they have an influence. And we look at the affiliations, we look at the organizations and institutions they're linked to, and a bunch of measures. But that's how we try to make sense of, as it were, to chart the thought leaders on the thought leadership landscape in terms of those two axes. So we want them to have viable ideas, and then we look for their visibility as well and where they show up. What's your next question?
I know the way you rank is like the Coca-Cola secret formula, right? Nobody knows them except you two. But I know it's very thorough. So there's lots of rankings out there. You have survived over 20 years. Have these criteria changed, the two kind of big dimensions?
I think hopefully we've done more than just survive, Antonio. Hopefully we have thrived. I think
right.
Yeah, you've got to be careful with, if you've got a formula like Coca-Cola, you don't change it in the wrong way. I think we've tweaked our formula over time. As I said, we've added the social. Of course, we had to add the social media part to it. We put more emphasis now on the 2-year period, so it's weighted more towards the last 2 years, so that we're recognizing people who are currently producing their best thought leadership. So yeah, there've been a few tweaks along the way.
And I think it's become more global during that 20 years. When we started, the kind of thought leadership world and the kind of business education world was dominated by American thinkers, American academics largely. And that's changed a lot over the 20 years. Now the Thinkers 50's nets is truly global. And I think we actually penalize people now for not having a global perspective. So, for instance, there used to be lots of business books, and they would have the usual 4 or 5 American companies as the case studies. And I don't really think you can do that anymore. You need global examples, and you need a global reach for the ideas. So I mean, our ranking and the people we feature on the Thinkers 50 radar of up and coming thinkers has never been more global, which makes it has made it much harder for us because it's very difficult to keep up to date with ideas emerging throughout the world.
Yeah, I've seen that evolution, diversity, globalization. You can see that in the rankings, in the radar. So I think that's a huge amount of work to spread your scope, right? And it takes
the other thing I think is there's a real blurring of disciplines. There was a time when you could separate out and say, you know, this is strategy and this is innovation, and now they overlap to such an extent that quite often, you know, innovation is the strategy. So it's becoming much harder. I mean, the business schools of the world face this dilemma too. They're still very siloed, really, in their academic departments, whereas the business world is increasingly integrated, and as I say, that the boundaries are blurring. So when, you know, for us, who we have a Distinguished Achievement Award for innovation, we have a Distinguished Achievement Award for strategy, for example, it becomes increasingly tricky to put somebody in a pure category. But I mean, you know, we welcome that. It's a good challenge. I think it's a good thing. It's moving in the right direction.
I see that Steve from the American Salvation Army is asking a question. And first of all, thank you. I always admire the work of the Salvation Army wherever they are in the world. Yes, the ideas. I mean, 20 years ago, the focus was the examples we featured and which were featured in business books were largely big corporations. Over the period since then, I think the emphasis has changed and there's greater awareness that you can learn from organizations of all types. So we have a Breakthrough Idea Award, which was won last time. I'm trying to remember. An Ideas into Practice Award, which was won by a Dutch nursing organization, which has a really remarkable approach to Buurtzorg, a remarkable approach to operating without hierarchy. So we're open to great ideas being put to work, no matter where they're put to work. And so the non-profit world increasingly has got lots of great examples. And there's lots of examples from the public sector as well. I mean, it used to be that government was kind of management wasn't really up to date with the latest ideas in management, but now over the last couple of decades, the public sector is trying harder and harder to embrace the latest ideas in management thinking.
In fact, one of the innovations for 2023 is to introduce, an award for public sector thought leadership as well, because obviously that's increasingly important and relevant.
Michelle from Manila. Sorry, Antonio. Is it fair to expect thought leaders to be great strategists because that's how they may have earned their experience to generate innovative ideas? Mm-hmm. Often thought leaders aren't great strategists, I would say.
I think there's what we've noticed over the years is, a slightly unfortunate pattern where you find that, the brilliant marketing professor has a rubbish website. It's a kind of a cobbler's children sort of thing where they don't always practice what they preach. I'd like to think, that the exception probably is Chan Kim and René Maubourne, who are incredibly strategic in terms of their output of thought leadership, in terms of, they're only on their third book. Blue Ocean Strategy was such a huge success, but it was all, I remember going to INSEAD. I don't know if you remember, Stuart, we went to INSEAD and Chan sitting across the table and saying, when is the best time to bring out a thought leadership book? And we'd done this analysis where we'd looked at, the big books of the last sort of 20 years and mapped it actually onto the business cycle. So we were able to say, as I say, bizarrely to Chan, the best time is just as the recovery kicks in, as the economy bounces and people are looking for the next big idea to grow their business. That's the time to come out. I think Blue Ocean Strategy came out in. When did Blue Ocean Strategy come out, to prove my point?
2008.
Yeah, no, before that it was
20 years ago, just as we're coming out of the
exactly
the bubble.
Yeah.
No,
I think so. Yeah. No, I think it was sort of 2000.
Yeah.
Should know. Really.
Phil from New Zealand says, how do you judge the contributors to thinking in public policy? And I'll just go back to what Des said about Blue Ocean Strategy. I think we judge all ideas by their implementation. There's too much academic research from business schools that's esoteric and has no connection to managers doing their job in organizations. So we judge ideas by their ability to be turned into reality, whether that's in the public sector or the private sector. Des was just talking about Chan Kim and Rennie Mo Burns' Blue Ocean Strategy. I went to an event in Malaysia, a Blue Ocean Strategy International Conference, and it was basically 2 days of examples from the Malaysian government of Blue Ocean Strategy being put to work within the government. For instance, Blue Ocean Strategy changed how the Malaysians ran their prisons. They took some of the ideas and completely recalibrated how they ran their prisons. So I think that's a great example of these ideas being put to work. And I think it doesn't matter whether it's in the public sector or the private sector. That's the acid test.
There's another question from Tom.
Does a thought leader always need to be based on solid academic research, or are great ideas good enough? Des?
I think, I mean, we do look to the rigor of research. We do look for things to be well grounded. But some people, when they've got a track record, it's interesting. I always notice when I read the Harvard Business Review that if you're an established thought leader, you can have ideas and you can write about them in a Harvard Business Review without having the same depth of research as a newcomer. So it's a little bit unfair in that sense. But I guess you earn your spurs. I guess if you're Phil Kotler or you're John Kotter, you've been writing about stuff for years, you're allowed to be a little bit less. The research for that particular idea doesn't necessarily have to run so deep. But we certainly look for. We also look for, as Stuart was indicating earlier, global case studies. Increasingly, we want people to have researched it beyond, and I mentioned reach. So it should reach across countries. It should reach across industries as well. So to that extent, the research needs to be in place. But I'm not sure that a good idea is a good idea. So
yeah, we're not particularly impressed by regression analysis. But no, we're impressed by academics who actually talk to managers, and that surprised me. I talked to a professor at a leading business school recently, and he was asking me how he could connect with real managers. And I said, you have classrooms full of real managers. Why don't you try talking to them? But if you look at management literature, there are very few books based on interviews of actual managers and about their jobs. If you go back to The Nature of Managerial Work by Henry Mintzberg, I think came out in 1973. And there's very few books that actually involve people learning directly from managers or just interviewing lots of managers. And to me and Thinkers 50, that's really quality research when you actually connect with managers.
I think
very few people do.
Yeah. I mean, we mentioned Roger Martin earlier, who the Playing to Win book, which was written with A.G. Lafley from Procter & Gamble. And he was really in the trenches. I mean, Roger was influential in not just hatching up the strategy, but actually implementing the strategy that brought P&G back into be the organization that it is. So again, that's very powerful. It's interesting too. I saw Roger, we did an event in Boston a few weeks ago, and we asked the thought leaders, what were their, what really annoyed them, what really upset them, made them angry, and made them, what made them passionate. And Roger's thing was, he said he was so tired of hearing senior managers say they've got a great strategy and then blaming middle management for not implementing it properly.
Wow.
He was saying there's no such thing as there shouldn't be a gap between those two things. The strategy and the implementation are one and the same. And if you can't pass the buck like that, you can't say we had a great strategy and then the guys trying to implement it did a bad job, because he said that's just nonsense. So I think it's quite an interesting. We can debate. But that was quite an interesting point. And you could see he was angry about it. He's obviously quite fired up about that. You should get him next time, Robin. You should ask Roger to come on the next time you do this, because he's got quite a lot to say about implementation. He'd be good.
So let's go to there's Lico, another question. What is?
Yeah. Lico says, what is your insight to involve companies under closed economies in global business arenas in newly liberalized economies given the competition? I think, and forgive me if I've misunderstood, Lico, I think what you're asking is how easy is it for organizations in emerging markets and newly liberalized countries to be examined and researched and popularized in the kind of business literature. I think it's very difficult. We've done lots of work with Chinese companies. We've worked very closely with the Chinese company Haier in particular. And there is...
Who are on the call, Stuart? Some of them are with us today.
Yeah, and they're a really hugely innovative company in terms of their management. They really are bold and doing some really interesting things, and have thought very deeply about how they manage the organization. But there's a degree of skepticism in the Western world to embracing best practice from Asia, China, or whatever it is. So I think brilliant companies from Africa and Asia, it is very difficult for them to get the attention and the research and that they deserve.
Thank you.
A question from Robin. Please share your tips for becoming a thought leader in implementation. Really, you should be telling us, Robin. But
I mean, for the audience, Stuart. For the audience, we have so many budding people in the group. And they're just, many of them are doing their doctorates, and many of them have become very passionate about implementation. So what's your recommendation for them? Where should they focus their energy time to really start to distinguish themselves in the field that they want to be known in?
I think one of the big changes over the last 2 decades is that when we first started, the people we championed and paid attention to, their ideas were actually quite narrowly focused on improving organizational performance, improving shareholder value, typically. Now, the people we champion and the people whose work we focus on, they want to change the world. They have a very keen sense of purpose. They realize that the power of the ideas is such that they really can make an impact. So their ambitions aren't trivial. So I think it's got to begin with a sense of purpose. You have to want to change the world, hopefully positively. So if you're talking about organizational behavior or implementation, you've got to have an idea that you think genuinely can change things, can change the organizations, can make the world a better place. So I think that's the starting point for any thought leader.
I think another characteristic is to be counterintuitive. Tell us something surprising. Tell us something we didn't know already. We referenced CK earlier. The fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. All of a sudden, we're looking at poverty in a different way. We're looking at micro markets. We're able to see the world differently. I think even if ideas aren't brand new, what the great thought leaders do is they offer us. They reframe the world, and they reframe problems, and they offer us a new lens. So if you can do that, if you can offer a different perspective, and it has to be something, as I say, counterintuitive. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it does have to be something that's fresh, I think, in order to break through, because there's just so much noise in this space that you've got to have a very clear point of view.
And I think distillation is really important. As a Scot, Robin, you might be aware of the difference between Irish whiskey and Scottish whiskey. Irish whiskey is much tastier and much smoother.
No, Irish whiskey we use for cooking.
Yeah, the Irish whiskey is smoother because it's been distilled 3 times. The Scottish whiskey is only distilled twice. And the thought leaders who are successful really distill what they're talking about down.
I like your connection.
I mean, if you think about the 4 Ps of marketing or the 5 forces, I mean, you can argue whether there are 5 forces, or there should be 6, or should there be more Ps. But actually organizing ideas into like the 10 Commandments, 7 Habits of Successful People, just having the confidence and boldness to say there's 5 things that matter, makes it much easier to communicate. So that's willingness to kind of distill things down. I mean, I think as well that a lot of the ideas and a lot of the people we feature, their ideas aren't. I mean, they're building on what's gone before, but they're phrasing it differently, using different examples. And there's a lot to be said for making sense of the organizational world for the new generation. So, for instance, in the States, Leon Prieto and Simone Phipps wrote a book about the history of African American management history and all the management ideas that came from the African American community. And there's an idea called cooperative advantage, which was articulated in the 1930s and 40s. And now they've brought it to a wider audience now. But it's very appropriate and applicable now. So there's lots of ideas that can be revisited and refreshed with new examples and new thinking. So I think
the examples point is good, just to build on that. I think, the great thought leaders are great storytellers. And if you can find fresh case studies to illustrate their points. I'm thinking Blue Ocean Strategy, for those of you who remember, it starts with the case study of Cirque du Soleil, which is, you've never seen that as a business case study before they used it. So the book goes straight into that. Or Amy Edmondson's work looking at the Chilean miners' rescue. It's just it's a great story to illustrate a point. It's a great you're already intrigued and drawn into the stories, and I think that's definitely a characteristic of great thought leaders. They pick interesting stories that we haven't heard before to illustrate their points.
One point I want to ask you personally is where I came to you with one of the most boring topics in the world, which was project management. And you say, come on, what's that? Come on. But somehow you helped me to elevate that, and you recognize that something was going on, the project economy. So I think this is something that you can help people as well. No, my idea was not in good shape, but there was something, and together we kind of, I don't know, I think there was a very interesting process maybe 7-8 years ago, which helped me to reach HBR. HBR comes to me with 12, 13 articles. So there was a click moment where you say, what a crappy idea, but maybe there's something inside that it makes sense.
Yeah. I'm sure we didn't elaborate it. It was a crappy idea. I'm sure we said it was a great. No, but I think that's a good example of bringing something to life. I think I remember working with you and teasing out. You'd got the hierarchy of purpose idea, exactly. And I remember we teased it out. And that was one of the early pieces you wrote because it was something. It was fresh and it was something interesting to say about project management. It was a reconceptualization of something. And I think that's, so reframing, it's a different way of thinking about it. It was a useful tool. Sorry, Stuart, you were going to say?
No, I was going to agree. We would be more polite. You
are more polite. And we meet in a pub. So
I mean, but I think there's many other instances where people just have an idea and can't really understand why they're not more famous, why the idea isn't sweeping the world. You have to work at the communication. You have to work at distilling it down, and you have to work at how you articulate it. And really, that is the hard work, and the rest of it is kind of building on that. I see some more comments.
Couple of questions. We need to finish in about 6 minutes, so let's take 2 or 3.
So Alex makes the point on public sector thought leadership. He notes that public sector projects are often politically charged and therefore time sensitive and focused on cheaper is better. How do you overcome such barriers to implementation of strategy? So I won't pass that to Des because I've already done that. I think it's actually the answer to that again goes back to Amy Edmondson's idea of psychological safety. You've got to create an environment and a culture where there's open discussion and communication and collaboration, and where those issues can be honestly surfaced and discussed, because once any issues, and there's politics in all decisions in all organizations, to bury the politics always simply makes it worse. So bringing things out into the open must be the route forward, I always think.
It was interesting. We do a podcast for provocateurs where we get provocative people on to talk about issues, and we're lucky enough to have a former astronaut on, and he was talking. He was on the mission just after one of the shuttle disasters, and he flew that mission as they went back into space, and he was talking about. He was using the language of psychological safety to explain what had gone wrong at NASA. And I just thought, this is amazing. I mean, I did tell Amy. In fact, I connected them. I think she's talked to him for her new book. But he's got this research engineer is what he was originally, and then he's an astronaut, and he's using the language of psychological safety to make sense of an organization like NASA. I think that's incredibly powerful. To think that some of this thought leadership reaches as far as that and can have such a profound influence.
Steve from the Salvation Army makes a question about, with strategy and implementation fusing together, does this fundamentally challenge the idea of leader versus manager? Do we need better terminology? Almost certainly yes. I think. I regard leadership as kind of a subset of management. And it's interesting, if you look back, leadership was barely discussed before the 1980s, really. It's only in the 1980s with the work of Warren Bennis and his book called Leaders that leadership became it became a heavy industry after that, and it's been discussed and there's millions of books written about it. But until that point, it wasn't really focused on. So it would be good to get a new vocabulary because, as I said earlier, manager and management has a bit of baggage, and leadership, I think, has become bogged down and kind of enmeshed in CEO pay and issues around CEOs, as if CEOs are the only people who practice leadership. And I think leadership is practiced universally. So yes, a new language, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
I mean, that's another characteristic of the great thought leaders is they do coin new phrases. They come up with a language that cuts through. Often it's quite simple language, and it might be a metaphor like the blue ocean strategy. We all get it. There's blue oceans and there's red oceans, and it's visual. You can get it. Similarly, sometimes the titles of books are just cut right through. I love Marshall Goldsmith's book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. I'm not sure you need to read the book. You just get the sentiment. Another great book title is Why Should Anyone Be Led by You? Which was Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones's book. And again, it just flips the thought. It just turns it around and makes you look in the mirror as a leader and ask yourself the question: why should anyone be led by me? Why should anyone follow me? And it just alters how you see that.
There's another question on thought leadership. Can we define that? Where does it start and end for thought leadership? Can we define the key touch points within an organization? I think that's quite an interesting question, really, because I'm always amazed when you go to a senior manager's offices, how few books there are there. And you would imagine that if you were a CEO, you'd be reading up a little bit on strategy and you'd be trying to read HBR and keeping up to date. So I'm always amazed that senior leaders don't read more and don't appear to can consume the world of management ideas in the way that other people in the organization do. And I think the audience and the touch points for thought leaders within organizations are all the people in organizations who are curious about their jobs and how they can do them better.
Great. Yes.
I guess we're
Yes,
running
go
out of time, Antonio. Yeah.
No, you wanted to say something, or?
No, I was just going to say, I always think with Thinkers 50, you know, we if you drew a Venn diagram, our sweet spot is we try to represent and try to reflect the practical thinkers, people who've got the implementation part in their ideas that can be implemented, and then where that overlaps with the thoughtful practitioners. So the people who are practitioners, but also a bit more reflective. And that's the sweet spot. That's the touch point, if you like. People, that's where the two things jive. That's where the two things meet.
And if people have got any more questions or would like to get in touch with us, if you just look at the Thinkers 50 website and just our emails there, or the general email there will get to us.
Perfect. We'll share the link to the website, and want to thank you, Stuart. It's a pleasure hearing you for all what you know, and also these amazing thought leaders bringing some of the concepts back. It's just so refreshing, and I really appreciate what you're doing. It's always a pleasure to be there in London every 2 years. So I'm looking forward to see you in November. I think Robin is going to be there. So thank you very much.
Always great to see you, Antonio. Always great to see you, Robin. And let us know if follow-up questions.
And guys, thank you for being in because this is a reverse conference, and you demonstrated that because you're normally the one doing the interviewing. You did great as the interviewees.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Antonio.
Thanks, you, guys. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks,
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Nice. Amazing. Back to you, Michael.
Great. So wonderful session. Lots of great questions. I wish we had more time because, again, there are just so many good thoughts. You know, I'm still stuck on a question that Alex asked earlier this evening. So hopefully we can capture some of these and pick them up. But if I am correct, Robin, at this point, you would like to move to a discussion of best practices.
Yes, thank you. We have a little bonus session for everyone. And we, Antonio and I, when we were planning the conference, then Michael, when he came in, we thought, okay, well, we're going to have everyone, the idea we briefly asked for Stuart and Des was to provoke the audience. And we thought, now you're all going to be buzzing and thinking about where can I have my breakthrough ideas. So Antonio and I have done some of the homework for you. It's been, Antonio, 5 years, 6 years since we started designing the strategy implementation professional course. And we spent 2.5 years developing it, recording, laying the material, deciding what content should go in, putting the model together that you can see on the screen, designing our 4 stages around crafting, embedding, executing, sustaining for each of the 7 modules. And, the funny side of that was we launched in January 2020, which of course was the cusp of the pandemic. And everybody started, going, it was obviously then in lockdown. And overnight, people were saying, my course is now online. Antonio and I were looking at each other going, it took us 2.5 years to build the course. And of course, the difference is the amount of what you put on the content. So we worked for that. And then we thought, okay, that's been now 3 years. So what we'd like to do now is a 30-minute session, which is going to be about 10-15 minutes of Antonio and I sharing. And then we're going to ask you to vote and discuss. And we're going to share with you, because the conference is about hands-on tools and tips, we want to provide hands-on tools and tips for great implementation in 2023. So we're going to take you around the 7 areas. We'll do a literally one-line introduction of each module, and then we've put together the tips and the tools. So here we go. The first one is leadership excellence. And you just heard Stuart and Des talking about how the importance of leadership and how critical it is. And from Roger Martin, that it's not just about crafting the strategy, but being engaged in the implementation. So the first one I would like to share before I hand over to Antonio is when we look at leadership today in 2023, there's a global shift happening from vertical to horizontal leadership. Now, these are maybe some terms that some of you have not heard. Vertical leadership you're familiar with. I promise you are. Why? Because it's what we do every day. We go to a meeting. We form a subcommittee of the main committee. We have to get approvals and signatures, and we keep having to go upstream for budgets and getting things signed off. And we're going upwards, which is why we call it vertical management. The shift is to horizontal leadership. And horizontal leadership is an article that Michael and I published together for Duke University in their program Dialogue. And we define it as the movement to when leaders now recognize that organizations are working horizontally. And they have to support agility, create what we've talked about earlier. Psychology is creating a environment which is safe. It's about using the data and empowering employees. And I'll give you one very practical example. And this was in the article Michael and I published together. Leaders demonstrate horizontal leadership when they go from being the first to speak in a meeting to the last. Normally, they set the tone, everybody agrees what they say, and it's very formalized. But when you're moving to agile and horizontal organizations, the leaders need to listen much more to understand what's going on, how the data is being used, what's being designed in the design thinking, what was created in the hackathon. And they go from being the first to the last person to speak. So I've given a little bit more of an introduction to kick it off. Antonio, do you want to take the second one?
Sustain an employee is exciting. So this is something that maybe in the past you would think that it's the role of HR and they need to take care of the people side. I think one of the priorities today for leaders and CEOs and implementation experts is making sure that people feel great at work. We heard how many times we heard today psychological safety. This is not the role of HR. This is the role of the leaders. So I think if you want a company to succeed, an organization, private, public, the people need to feel happy to go to work. They need to be proud to go to work. And this has been, for me, something that I changed my mind. I thought HR is, of course, the person in charge of doing all these soft things. And today I recognize that, no, this is the leader. And if there's one of the top priorities of a leader is making sure that the people feel great at work. And if you're doing transformation, that people feel great in your transformation program. This is a top priority. It's not the last one. It's not somebody else's problem. It's the leader's priority. So I think just stating the evidence, but just wanted to highlight that this is something that I see coming up and as a big priority and for leadership excellence.
And very much follows on from what Liran was saying about looking after your employees contributes to making a great place.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, for those of you who've been in the Institute since we started 3 years ago, you'll have noticed last year that we changed from this module, which used to be focused called financial, to value creation. And this was to recognize the global shift that a company is no longer in business to provide for the shareholder, but is responsible to stakeholders. So you have responsibility for sustainability, your community, the environment, as well as your employees, the customer, your suppliers. So it's your key stakeholders. And for me, the best practice for 2023 I'll share is there's a shift going on that we're moving away from annual budgeting to quarterly. And the driver for this is for agile. Companies are struggling to adopt agile when you have an annual budgeting because they can't create the resources fast enough to support the Scrum initiatives, the new ideas that are coming through. So quarterly budgeting is then allowing you to support the rapid innovation and growth that we now work at an accelerated rate.
Right. And the second point, it's not something completely new, but I can see that this is becoming an urgency. When you look at the amount of projects that companies are launching, and for several reasons, for the speed of change in the world, for this shorter life cycles of strategies and products, for the increased competition. So companies today, they have an exceed too much projects going on. They launch more projects than they complete as well. This is something that I'm working with large companies, is how can we control that? How can we can focus more, and focus prioritization is a very difficult skill. And knowing what the HBR editor, chief editor, told me when I published with them, he said, your projects are your future. This is how you create value. And I told Adi, I said, you cannot imagine how poorly companies manage their future. And one basic rule, this is something that we share, Robin and I, when I do workshops, is less is more. It's easier to implement 3 strategic initiatives than 12, than 8. So try to focus. It's hard to choose the 3 ones, but once you choose them, just go full on. And the rule that I always said, never launch a new initiative if you don't stop, finish, cancel 2 or 3. That will help you to reduce and to focus.
And just a reminder, we're going to show you all of them at the end, and we're going to ask you to vote. So we'll highlight the next few. Under the business model. So the business model in the strategy implementation professional course is understanding how the organizational structure supports the new strategy. Why? Because you change your strategy, you change the way you work. That's what new strategy means. It means working differently. And in 2023, a new term that's emerged out of digital is to identify the impact of ecosystems within your business. Now, I'm a bit embarrassed because we have Joshua and some of the team from Hire, and the Hire Group were doing this 10 years ago. And a Hire Group, have become the largest and most successful, and they're actually nominated tomorrow when we'll be announcing the company awards, because they've done a phenomenal job at eliminating the middle management, building micro enterprises. And to give you an example from Hire, they created, for example, they don't sell products, they sell a platform. So in Europe, they sell a wine cooler. And the wine cooler, you don't just buy the product, but it connects you with other people who like similar wine. It follows what wines you buy, and it makes recommendations. It gives you opportunity to visit vineyards of your favorite wines. It gives you interesting new releases and information. So they build a community and a platform and create an ecosystem. So that's a very simple introduction, but ecosystems are very much the new frontier for doing business.
So I think this is a big topic. Now we hear every day about artificial intelligence and big data more than ever. And I think one of the biggest challenges when you want to work into this space of AI is data. And most of you recognize that data is not a high priority in most organizations. It's just spread all over the place. It's not up to date. It's not consistent. And if you want to be competitive, if you want to use artificial intelligence and all these latest technologies, you need to put data first. You need to have a strategy for understanding your data, modeling your data, and having somebody owning the data as well. So this is what we call data-driven organization. So instead of ignoring data, we need to embrace it. We need to understand it. There's so much into it. You know, the big companies like Google or Facebook, or they've been pioneers in how data you can extract information to drive strategy. So I think companies should embrace that too. And it should be a priority when you're looking at your strategy and how you're adapting your business model to be competitive in this digital and changing world.
All right, so 4 of 7, and we'll pick up the pace a little bit. And culture, we all familiar with. We all know the expression strategy eats culture eats strategy for breakfast. So 2 quick tips on the culture evolution. In this area, we focus on helping you understand that your culture drives the way a company implements. 2 companies can have the same strategy, but how they implement it is driven by the culture. And evolving culture means making people understand each other better to work together. We're finally breaking down silos. Digital has broken through that barrier, because you cannot become a digitally driven company if you're siloed, because you end up competing rather than collaborating in a hackathon, a design thinking, a journey map. So in culture, we're finally bringing people together and understanding, and collaborating and working together more than ever before.
And very much connected to that one is that in the past, a strategy will last 7 years. That was the average of a strategy. Knowing that strategies now last 2-3 years max, that means that the culture has to adapt. Culture has to support, right? You need to create the right behaviors to make sure that the implementation becomes a priority, that people focus on execution. And this is driven as well with the culture. So this starts with the leadership. They need to recognize the role they play on the culture, but also make sure that people understand that we need to change it quickly. Somebody talked today about the change fatigue, right? I think Liran, and there's nothing that you can do. We need to train and we need to be comfortable with change. If you stop changing, the business will not last very long. So it's really a very important aspect that culture has to be addressed, has to be supporting the implementation, even more critical than before.
In our stakeholder management, we focus very much on the module about how people are collaborating. And the key new message in 2023 is we got to create a platform for conversations to engage and communicate the strategy. So now we've got to leverage the technology. In all our research, Antonio and I have done over 20 years, even before we started the Institute, every single research, one of the top 3 reasons why strategy implementation fails, poor communication. People don't know. Only 5% of employees know what the strategy is. So we got to create new platforms and leverage new technologies to engage and communicate the strategy.
And then I think something that I cover in my HBR book is the way we look at objectives and targets and goals. We tend to do that still very much top down. We still use the hierarchical approaches. It's decided at the top and then it's cascaded. If we go to a more transversal, horizontal type of leadership, that means also that we need to involve different part of the organization on the definition of the goals. It cannot be top down anymore. It has to be done together. Key stakeholders. I use that now a lot in benefits for projects. Ask your stakeholders what to expect, what can they do better. So when you involve stakeholders in decision making, in goal setting, the buying is automatically. When you impose people things, that doesn't work. People will get frustrated, resistant. So this is a game changer. Involve your stakeholders when you're setting targets, looking at benefits.
So the penultimate, we kicked off with Liran from Google sharing the importance of employee well-being. And we used the term employee engagement. We didn't predict 6-7 years ago how much more critical employee engagement was going to become in a digital world, because leaders set the digital ambition, but the implementation is bottom up. Why? Because it's the employees who do the customer journey mapping, who come up with the new ideas, who know what the customer frustrations and problems are. So for this one, we want to ask early adopters, and Liran used this as well to find champions, but we want people to volunteer. When somebody chooses to do something, they are 5 times more likely to take the action. So these are your employees who see the implementation as an opportunity. They're like, thankfully, we're getting on. And this is one of the strongest, most consistent best practices that's become even more critical in 2023.
And linked to that, I think it's the other, we forget often to talk about the why. You say we're going to do a digital transformation, but why? Why are we doing that? What's the goal, right? So we are not used to talk about the why. And if we want to increase engagement of employees, let's talk about the why. Let's talk about the purpose. I introduced the concept of the project purpose, because that's what drives engagement, not a business case, not targets. It's the why which drives engagement. And we're not used to talk about the why. We talk about the what. So this is really another of these easy to implement tools, which has big impact.
And in the 7th and final module on the strategy implementation, where we focused on our roadmap was tracking performance. Because, we buried our head when we did our research that leaders were only once or twice a year checking on the implementation for the future of their business. So the first tip for 2023 is the world is moving much faster. The strategic landscape is changing underneath your feet much quicker. So we need to start monthly meetings, making sure implementation is the first thing on the agenda, not the last. Where we go, oh, we have 3-4 minutes left. What about our implementation? No, if this is the future of your organization, it has to be first. And that reflects and demonstrates its importance throughout the whole organization.
And related to that as well is, now we talk about shorter life cycles for strategy, the same for measures. We need to incorporate new measures as we change our strategy. The KPI should not be the same. Your balance scorecard, whatever you use, OKRs, we need to adapt them. We need to see evolution. If you're working on digital transformation, great examples, great book from Robin. There's a lot of new KPIs. This is what successful companies do. So we change our strategy, we change the measures. Very, very important as well. Concept.
All right, so we've shared with you 14, and we realize that's a lot to grasp in just a short time.
My pleasure in the final portion of this morning or this evening to introduce Paul Leenwand. And Paul is the global managing partner of capabilities-driven strategy and growth at PwC. Paul's based in Chicago, advises clients on strategy, growth, and capability building, and has written some great books. Some of these, in particular, the Harvard Business Review or the Harvard Business Publishing, you've probably encountered. Books such as Beyond Digital, How Great Leaders Transform Their Organization and Shape the Future. And also Strategy That Works, How Winning Companies Close the Strategy to Execution Gap. And on top of that, Paul, I saw you hold an MBA from a Big Ten school, Northwestern. Thank you for joining the conference. And I'll show my age when I say this. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Excellent. The floor. Where is the floor, Michael?
Yes, I know. I know.
I'm sure there's a floor underneath all of us at the moment. It's great to be with you. We were presenting our first book. This is like 12 years ago, and we were going around the world to business schools and other environments, and we noticed that students in a particular business school in Europe were asking really, really hard questions. And we said, "What's going on here? Are we just tired?" Getting endless tough questions. And the dean of the business school was sitting there, and the dean came up to us and said, I've got your answer to that question, why these questions are so tough. The first is that, in many ways, consultants are not always liked by strategy professors. So the students are trying to impress their professors. So I thought that makes sense. Second reason was students are very diverse. Consultants are often presenting to a particular industry or particular company, particular function. But in a student audience, you get kind of everyone there. And the third reason the dean said was the students are never going to see you again, so they don't mind defending you with a tough question. So if that's the reason for a tough question today, let it be. The theme here is, are you executing your strategy, or is your strategy executable? I'm going to dive right in, and let's go through this a little bit. The only other thing to note about my experience is I do teach also at Northwestern's Kellogg School. I've been doing that for about 12 or 13 years. It's a great experience. Now, fortunately, the students do see me over and over again. So I guess maybe they're asking a little easier questions. But I also, spend a lot of my time doing research on the topic of strategy and leadership. And so great to be here. We'll dive right in. This is a presentation that's just based on a bunch of what I describe as myths about strategy and execution. So we'll kind of go through these one by one. And then again, love to kind of hear your reactions and questions. Your purpose is clear. During the pandemic, lots of companies went back and re-looked at their purpose statements, right? We wanted to make sure that they were exciting and bold and ambitious, because we had to retain people and we had to attract people. One of the exercises I'd encourage you all to do is just pick an industry with your teams. Ask your team or yourself, you can do this, to go look up every best strategy or purpose or mission statement, write the name of the company next to it, and then separate the name of the company from the purpose statement and try to put it back like 10 minutes later. It's a very difficult exercise. I'd say 95% of purpose statements are way too vague. Way too vague. And in fact, in the last couple of years, in order to add to the ambition of purpose statements, they got even vaguer. So it's a great exercise, and it reminds you that we're not really creating differentiated strategies, right? So when we complain that strategies are not executed, many of them are not that clear to begin with. So it's hard to execute a strategy you don't know. Here's a nice one. Bigger societal problems will be solved by someone else. Someone else will get that, maybe the government. No. Most of these challenges remain unsolved. In our last book, Beyond Digital, we looked at this company, Komatsu. I see them all the time now. I think it's when you write a book and you profile companies and do a lot of research, suddenly your mind is attuned. So I see this equipment on every construction site, it seems. Komatsu was selling and renting equipment. That was their business. It was a very good business, in fact. But they had an opportunity to, in a very local geography, help manage a construction site, because construction sites are a mess. Right? There's not a lot of technology. There's not a lot of data. We have labor shortages. There's safety shortages. We have material problems. But you have all these different subcontractors with contractors that are not that industrialized. Komatsu decided to take that on. They've built an incredible ecosystem where everybody shares information, and they have the analytics to organize all the activities, right? So this is a great, bigger problem to be solved, and they've taken it on. By the way, in so building that ecosystem, they get incredible data. That's a big thing we talk about in the book Beyond Digital in terms of privileged insights. How do you learn more about your customers than anyone else? This is a good one. We often hear, yeah, strategy, that's fantastic, but it doesn't really matter in the end of the day, like good strategy, bad strategy. I apologize. This is from 2012. We've updated a little bit, but but this was published again recently. And we looked at we call it like the biggest losers, not to kind of make fun of the TV show, but every big valuation decrease that's happened. And we look at what are the reasons for that, right? What happened to explain this decrease? And you've got some external factors, operational, compliance, but almost all of the reasons are strategic, right? It was either a decision that was made or a set of decisions, or often decisions that were not made. Strategy is incredibly important. And we don't spend enough time actually doing it. Okay, I think this is my favorite. I spent yesterday with 2 executive teams of very large organizations, and they were obsessed with this topic, right? Disruption is coming, disruption is coming. What are we doing? What are all the trends out there? What do we figure out? So disruption has been around for a long time. This business that you see in front of you disrupted the automobile. Interestingly, when the automobile was invented, a lot of the carriage makers, if you will, kind of looked at the automobile and did what we do today, which is like, oh, that automobile is never going to take off. It's a flammable liquid. It's dangerous. You know, that's not going to work. But 2 of the carriage makers said, you know, we don't know what's going to happen, but we're really good at suspension and brakes and putting a vehicle together. What if we were to support the auto industry? And they did incredibly well. And it's a reminder that yes, disruption comes, but we can typically see it coming. I mean, Amazon was around for a long time, Alibaba, so on and so forth, but companies have the opportunity to shape their own future. And so we encourage people not to worry too much about figuring out where disruption is coming and figuring out how they're going to drive their own change, just like these carriage makers did. And of course, the taxi industry is the example of like, oh, you know, disruption came. Yes, but the taxi market was a highly disadvantaged market. It was like asking for disruption, right? We often think about what were those great advantages that the taxi market had. They always had clean vehicles. They always knew where they were going. They always had like incredibly reliable and safe drivers, right? No, they didn't really have that. They had something called nowhere to go often, like in London, but then poor GPS came around and sort of disrupted them with that advantage. They were left with regulation, which is a dangerous place to be. So yes, disruption comes. It's not that disruption does not come. We did an analysis that was published in the Wall Street Journal, which actually showed just how slow disruption is. Technology disruption is fast, but business model disruption actually happens quite slowly. People are motivated by role, praise, compensation, benefits. We repeat this study a lot. This is so sobering, right? 39%, I can clearly see the value of my job. My job allows me to fully leverage my strengths, 22%, so on and so forth. We talk about this in strategy because the problems that companies are taking on now are massive. They're not going to take them on if their people are not motivated, right, to go solve those issues. So we can't be worried about motivation because we just want to retain people. That's like table stakes. We have to do this because we have strategies that have to get figured out and strategies that have to be executed, and we need a workforce that's excited. This might be the last one, actually. Your leaders and board have this figured out, right? They know what to do. This comes from a HB article that we published recently on the front cover, talked about leadership teams. One of the things we talk a lot about is the gap between where leaders are on their skill set and where people expect them to be. So these are a set of paradoxes, right? Kind of in some ways opposites, but people are being asked to do both, like strategic executor. You might remember the days where we would talk about visionary leaders and operators, right? They were kind of different people and different companies would need one or the other. Now you really have to do both. And you've got to be the tech savvy humanist, right? You got to think about technology, but understand how it affects human beings. The gaps are massive. The kind of pink red is what do people expect? What's relevant for them? And the gray is where are my leaders today? We can't solve all these gaps, but if we're going to execute strategy, if we're going to develop great strategy, we're going to have to do a lot better on many of these dimensions or find the teams around us that can do that. So Robin, I don't know how I did on my time. I think I was using I'm from New York originally. So
I felt it. It was an East Coast speed race there.
There you go.
Shared a lot. So first of all, thank you for giving us the opportunity to interact with you today. And maybe I can just dissect some of the things you just shared with a few questions. Would that be all right, Paul?
That'd be great.
Okay. So, you share the passion that all of us do in the Institute, the Strategy Implementation Institute, that we all want to see better implementation. So what guidance would you give executives who are struggling to close that strategy execution gap?
I think the first thing, and this is something that I had to learn the hard way, is that we won't solve that gap until we recognize the glue that actually sits between strategy and execution. Because all of the great advice and processes and tools to execute strategy are meaningless when your strategy is pointing in one direction, your execution is trying to do something different. And that's why all of our research started with this idea of why capabilities are so important. And capabilities are that glue. Capabilities define essentially what are you going to be differentiated at. If you think about strategy, what is strategy? Strategy should be about creating an advantage. There is no such advantage without capabilities in our experience and in our research, right? Assets come and go. I can come up with a patent, but how do I come up with a patent? It's a capability that got me there. And so if I understand capabilities, I can differentiate, but capabilities also are what we execute every day, right? These are what functions own. It's what they invest in and what delivers the results. And so if we can be clear about the important capabilities, if we can define what we say, the 3 to 6 things that really matter, we have created the glue between strategy and execution. Now, it doesn't stop there. There's a lot to do to execute strategy. But if we haven't even defined what these capabilities are, I don't believe anything in the tool front will ever get you to close that gap. And capabilities are messy, they're complicated, and that's why they're so valuable, but it's often why we shy away from them. So the advice to leaders is get after this. And in fact, the only reason why we've published so much with Harvard is because Harvard approached us after Prahalad had come up with core competence theory and said, capabilities are really where that needs to go, right? How do we connect this into strategy and execution? And that's the basis of sort of all of the things that we've done.
And Paul, I'm going to ask a follow-up just for some, because English is second language for many of the people on the call and in the Institute. Can you give me an example of what a capability, what you're meaning by that, just for those who maybe it doesn't connect immediately language-wise?
No, absolutely. And in fact, independent of language, I think this is such an important question. A capability is not a function. So a capability itself is not marketing or innovation, although people will often describe those functions as capabilities. A capability is something that has very specific output that matters for your purpose. So an example for me is Frito-Lay, a company around the world. We love Frito-Lay. They have a capability called direct store delivery. It's not a supply chain capability per se. It's actually a cross-functional capability that gets merchandise, lots of potato chips for the most part, from their warehouse to the shelf. It involves truck routes. It involves technology because they invented the first handheld that was used to sort of figure out what to do in every single truck and in every single route. It involves people, it involves data, it involves incentives. So a capability is cross-functional and gets a clear output. That DSD, direct store delivery capability, is incredibly important for Frito-Lay. That's part of their differentiation. So I hope that helps.
Yes, it does. Thank you for that. Antonio and I started the Institute because I think you and I also share this passion, because one of the first articles where you and I connected on was when you published this 8% leaders, only 8% of leaders have the ability to craft and execute strategy. And that's how you and I started connecting on our passion to close the gap. Today, do you see that leaders have the mindset, the tools and the equipment to do it? Have you seen any improvements? And maybe for those who are not familiar, just refer back to your Harvard article that mentioned that.
It's fascinating. We published that article, and if you remember Roger Martin, who co-authored the book with A.G. Lafley, which I think is called Playing to Win. I think I have that wrong.
It is, yeah.
Something just like that. He actually wrote on top of our article that one of the great things about that research was the fact that very few people were seen in the extremes, right? You had very few people that were seen at very good at strategy, right, but very bad at execution. And that was actually the good news in that, which is although only 8% were doing both, leaders were starting to recognize they had to build those skills. And it has definitely gotten better, Robin, since that study has been out. We've repeated it a few times. It's not gotten massively better, but it's headed in the right direction. I think people intuitively understand that they have to, in today's environment, grasp and take on some of the big topics, but they also have to figure out how their organizations execute. Just kind of saying, you guys figure it out, that's not enough. And that's very different than leaders were trained 20 years ago. But it's taken, right, not only attrition, which has happened very fast because CEO turnover has been moving faster and faster. It's more the training and experience of the next generation of leaders. But I think people are definitely getting that at this point.
Awesome. There's some questions coming in. Tom, it's wonderful to see you. Tom was one of our very early members of the Institute. So Tom, are you happy to share and ask your question directly to Paul?
Sure, yes.
Good to see you, my friend.
Hey, good to see you, Robin. So I was wondering if capabilities are so important, to what extent, and getting new capabilities, acquiring those new capabilities is so important. To what extent do you think that leaders or managers are themselves aware that they actually need to invest in changing their capabilities? Or to what extent is it that they think, that's a problem that others will have to solve?
Unfortunately, Tom, I think there's many in the second category. I think capabilities, first of all, our organizational construct does not really reinforce capabilities because we manage functions. But every great capability that all of us could write down on a piece of paper are cross-functional in nature. And so the inherent human dynamics are to work on best-in-class functional capabilities, which are often too narrow. There are great companies, I mean, that have taken on the topic of capabilities. So IKEA is one, Inditex with Zara, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon. They have created capability agendas where the CEO, so Lego, for instance, right, the CEO will invite capability teams to actually bring up where are they on these capability journeys, right? You can imagine for Lego, like plastic injection molding is an important thing. That's a capability. It's not just a supply chain capability because there's lots of design elements that go into that, marketing elements that go into that. And so it's not necessarily impossible to get there. And we see lots of companies doing it. But I do think, to your point, there's a lot of organizations that understand the value, but kind of like are afraid because maybe their priority won't be listed in the top. Maybe they're going to have to team in a new way. And actually, in the latest book that we wrote, Beyond Digital, where we profiled 12 really incredible companies, we were seeing the breakdown of the organizational model, taking out functions and putting in what were being called outcome-oriented teams that actually were permanent, that brought functional skills together to manage capabilities. So that's one thing that I think will help us in the next few years.
Steve, if you're there, Steve is one of our newer members of the Institute, came in, he's working at Salvation Army. Steve, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Hey, good to see you. And in uniform as well. Good.
Yeah, sorry guys, I'm dressed up to the nines today.
So, platform is yours to speak to Paul.
Thanks, Paul. Listen, I love your 6 paradoxes of leadership there, and something which was striking me as you were running through it is, and sort of looking at the disruption thing, how it's sort of there. It reminded me of the idea of how disruption is sort of gradual and then it's sudden. But when you look at those sort of paradoxes, we always assume that that the leader will be sort of on the watchtower looking out for this disruption, but often they seem to be the last one to catch the leading indicators. So there's almost a blind spot there, and so I'm wondering, if we're over assuming capabilities in these proficiencies, how do we then help leaders to sort of awaken to, first of all, the potential of the blind spot, and then to help to strengthen them to capture sort of leading indicators so they can either mitigate or leverage an opportunity before it's too late?
Steve, great question. Obviously, in some ways, what we really want leaders to do is be honest with themselves about what they're missing And that's partly why we publish so much on those paradoxes, is because we want that to be a tool. And there's lots of other tools. So in a way, it doesn't matter. To your point, the trick is, will leaders take the time and inventory where they're starting from? We don't think leaders can close the gaps in, there's a few human beings that are probably possible of managing those 6 paradoxes, but part of it is also building a leadership team, right, that is capable of managing the 6 paradoxes. And so part of the advice is, it's okay, right? You're not going to get there. You have weaknesses. It's okay. Work on your strengths, but fill in the gaps with some of your team around you. I think on the point about our leaders appropriately looking out for disruption, I think you're right. We have kind of 2 camps maybe 3 camps. We have a camp that's very focused on disruption, and I would say overly anxious, where they spend almost too much energy trying to study where everybody else is going. And that was kind of the point earlier, right? They don't figure out what they need to do. We have a group of people that are a little bit like, that's overwhelming what's happening out there. Let me just focus internally. They're not shaping their own future. They're just kind of running the business. And then we do have a small group of people that I think get the balance right. Our advice is not ignore what's happening around. We love what's happening around, but we want organizations to understand what they're incredibly great at. Like, every organization has incredible strengths. And when we recognize what those strengths are, we can actually go form new businesses, build new capabilities around those strengths. The Danaher, there's so many great examples of companies that did something incredible and used that to disrupt other industries. And that's a small segment, but we're hoping that grows with, to your point, leaders that are a little bit more aware of what they need to do.
Steve, thank you. Paul, we have just a few seconds left. I'm going to do a quick fire, which is going to be very spontaneous. I'm going to say 1-word, 2-word answers. Would that be all right?
Yep.
Okay, so if you had to give one tip in just a couple of words to a CEO to succeed tomorrow on the launch of their new strategy, what would it be?
Make sure your team can handle it.
Okay, thank you. Your biggest frustration in all the research that you've done with so many organizations about why they keep failing?
Board governance.
Okay, thank you. A lot of middle managers get frustrated that they are not the senior, the C-suite, and they say, well, what can I do? I'm not the big fish, I'm not at the top. What advice would you give to the middle managers who want to make a difference, but they're just frustrated their company isn't doing what they want it to be doing?
Instead of answering that, I'll just say that Sally Blount, who is the dean of the Kellogg School, and I wrote an article in HBR. I think it's How to Become a CEO. So I'd advise reading that. It's a very short article, and it's got 3 different archetypes of people that make it. And so it's a great way of seeing where you're at and what you might need to do.
Okay, thank you. And last question is, a lot of the members, they join our institute because they want to learn more about implementation. If you were to recommend one thing to focus on, because the conference is the great implementation, what would be one tip for people learning about implementation? I mean, not just knowledge-wise, but action-wise, that would make a great implementation?
I'll probably stick to my brand here and just say, go look at the purpose statement of your organization or the best version of a strategy, and imagine being someone in middle management trying to execute it and trying to understand whether they would have any idea what to do.
All right, Paul, thank you. Having you, I'm sorry it's such a short time, but I'm glad logistically we managed to make it work. There's one more question, is it okay to share your slide deck with the people?
Yeah, it is. Yep.
Okay, thank you for that permission. On behalf of the Institute, we're many oceans apart. The time difference and everything caused the trouble, but thank you for giving us the opportunity for coming and sharing with us your wonderful insights, the research you've been doing. And I really encourage everyone to read Beyond Digital, because the depth you went into in the companies is phenomenal. On behalf of the Institute, Paul, thank you very much for giving us your time.
Thank you, Robin. Be well.
Thanks, Paul. And Michael, over to you, and we'll wrap things up, everyone.
All right, we are down. Actually, we are at the end of time, but just a quick preview ahead of tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be the inaugural Strategy Implementation Institute Awards, and we'll have some fresh guests and some fresh speakers and some fresh cases that you'll be able to learn from on that. And as a teaser, Robin, you and Antonio have a surprise for everybody tomorrow. Surprise topic.
Yep, we're going to be doing something in the closing session.
So stay tuned. We'll learn more about that tomorrow, but that should wrap us up for
And
day
the timing
one.
for tomorrow, I'm
Yes.
going to make sure I give the right timing, is for those of us, Singapore time is 3 p.m. and Central European time is 9 a.m. kickoff. So 9 a.m. Central European time, 3 p.m. in Singapore time, and this is so others in different time zones can join.
All right. Well, thank you, Robin. Thank you, Antonio. Most importantly, thank you to all of our guests for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. More great content, more great ideas. You set the bar high today, Robin. So tomorrow's.
Thank you, Michael. See everyone
Thanks,
tomorrow.
everybody.
Have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.